Services, or FCSS as it's commonly known, is a preventive social services program that started in the 1960s and continues today. I recently had the opportunity to look back on the history of FCSS and to speak with some key people involved with the program over the years. Social development can be traced back thousands of years, whether it's King Hammurabi of Babylon that suggested we help one another in times of hardship, or the teachings of Jesus Christ encouraging us to love one another. As people, we're designed to live in community. Social policy, on the other hand, has been designed to shape the way in which we might live in community. Much of Alberta's social policy has been shaped by early European concepts, poor laws in England that distinguish between worthy and unworthy poor, and the early development of our current voluntary sector. Father Vincent de Paul of France is credited with founding one of the earliest charitable organizations back in 1625. Here in Alberta, things really started to pick up in the 1930s when William Aberhart formed the new social credit government. Aberhart was already well known by Albertans through a regular radio program that provided a mix of religious prophecy and economics. Aberhart led the social credit government in Alberta until his death in 1944, at which time Ernest Manning assumed the leadership role as Premier. Community and voluntary sector leadership were critical components of Alberta's social policy back then, as they continue to be now. Programs such as child welfare and social assistance were being delivered by municipalities and community organizations. A 1947 report commissioned by the IODE criticized the government at the time due to the lack of standards and, interestingly, planted a seed for Premier Manning as the report called for preventive social programming. The original PSS legislation, Preventive Social Services, was passed on July 1st, 1966, and it was determined that a separate act would be developed, Bill number 20, as opposed to simply adding a chapter to the existing Public Welfare Act. Probably an important side note in our own history. I recently had the opportunity to sit down with John Lackey, an early leader in the history of FCSS, and he has such a wonderful way of telling the story of FCSS.
I was a social worker in Lethbridge in 1961. That's my first job in social services, and the 60s were a very interesting time in Alberta's history because, and now everywhere in North America, of course, the 60s were interesting, but Alberta was always different. We'd had a government with Premier Manning as the Premier since I think he'd been the Premier for about 25 years at that time. And there were 3 members in the opposition. He was solidly in power. The government were almost all men. They were quite religious, very strong conservative Christian fundamentalists, many of them from all over Alberta really, and the government reflected that. And so a lot of people said, well, how did PSS ever come into being with such a government, such a conservative government that you wouldn't think would support anything social, let alone an innovative program like PSS? Well, one has to remember that they were pretty secure. They had a surplus of money, which Alberta tends to have every now and then. I'm not sure which way we're going now. But Premier Manning, in maybe 1964, 65, called all his deputies down to his office, including Duncan Rogers, who was the deputy of Alberta Social Services at the time, and said they had a surplus, and could they please come up with some ideas as to how to spend this money? Well, you can imagine. The deputies tripped over themselves in running back to their offices to meet with their management committees to say, hey, there's several millions of dollars here. And that was the climate at that time. They also didn't like social welfare or child welfare. I mean, they thought that all children should be at home being looked after by their parents, of course, as all of us do. People on social assistance were an enema. I mean, we should not have such families living in this province. And so when Duncan Rogers and his few senior managers came up with the idea of a preventive program, which which they then tried to sell to the Premier and his cabinet and caucus. They sold it on the basis that they could prevent children from ending up in child welfare and ending up or preventing families from having to receive social assistance. And of course that was music to the ears of a strong right government, you know. I mean, self-sufficiency, people pulling up their own bootstraps, all that stuff. That's how it was sold, the whole philosophy of preventive social services at the time. And of course Duncan Rogers was an accountant, you know. You wouldn't expect this kind of thinking to come from him. But he too was a religious man. He had a strong religious ethic, a charitable ethic, if you will. But when you think of charity, charity is, again, helping people, you know, do what's best for themselves and becoming independent, removing the need for social dependence. And so that's what they pushed with this particular government. The minister of the day was a man named Mr. Helmrest, and he was a sheep farmer from Milk River. And he understood sheep farming and not a whole lot about, you know, social services. And I remember an interesting meeting. There was a loose profession or association of professional social workers in those days, and there weren't many social workers around that had that had any qualifications. But they met with Mr. Helmrest to advance something, and he couldn't understand their jargon, which social workers occasionally will use. And so when he couldn't understand what they were talking about, he started to talk about sheep farming, you know, and so I don't like to say this, but the professionals had very little, if anything, to do with professional social workers, with the creation of preventive social services. I mean, he booted them out the door and, you know, thought they were a bunch of whatever, and they thought he was, you know, what a man to be developing social policy for the province of Alberta. It was really quite amusing. At the same time, the Liberals were in place in Ottawa under Lester B. Pearson, and he was, you know, this is the time of the development of Medicare and the CPP and a whole lot of real things that have survived the times, and they had lots of money, obviously, as well, and they were anxious to have some impact in social services across the country, because there was a great variance in the quality of social services in Canada. Some provinces had moved ahead, some had stayed behind. Same in Alberta. The cities had developed, the big cities and small cities had developed small social service departments. They were offering child welfare and social assistance, much to their chagrin as the caseloads grew. And they were getting very concerned about how much municipal money they had to put in. So, and the province then was looking at this mishmash of social services across Alberta and saying we need to bring some level of standardization to this and a little bit of quality to it. So that was taking place as well.
You know how history works, right? Napoleon Bonaparte is quoted as saying, "History is a version of past events that people have decided to agree upon." I had the opportunity to hear one of the agreed upon versions of history that has become part of our FCSS legend. Let's go back to John for this little insight.
The program was first introduced in 66, 67. The initial name for the program was Preventive Innovative Social Services. And it stayed that way for a while until somebody realized, you know, the acronym wasn't that encouraging, so it did change to PSS at the time.
The Department of Public Welfare published an annual report in 1966 to identify some of the original principles put forward to support the new PSS legislation. Direction and programming would evolve at the local level. It would be optional for municipalities, and the financial support would come from the province. So therefore, the legislation would need to be enabling legislation. By the 1970s, the deficit and reimbursement practices for the 80-20 cost share were being highlighted in government reports, and municipalities agreeing to sign up for PSS would be required to hire a qualified director. Let's go back to John for some of his insights on the 70s and 80s.
We went out and we scoured the province. I think about 65% of the province had PSS. at that time, 1974. All the big cities were in, all the small cities were in, but the rest of the province was largely not. And so we went out and we would wait for an invitation. Some progressive individual locally would invite us to a council meeting. This is how it usually happened. Could you come and speak to the council about this wonderful program you have? And the municipality can get 20% dollars from this program. It was often sold strictly on that. The municipality may have been paying for programs more than that already if they were a bit enlightened, but there weren't too many enlightened, municipalities around at that time. And but they could get 20% dollars if they joined us. So we would go out and speak to councils and lay out, all the benefits of having a PSS program. And I can remember once I was in Pincher Creek talking to the council down there, and they were one of the few NDP. We had NDP in those days who were actually in the legislature. One person was from Pincher Creek. One MLA was from Pincher Creek. He had invited me down to talk to the Pincher Creek Council, which was very conservative, and I was laying out this happily to the council what a wonderful thing this was, and the mayor kept shouting something like "sheik and sheet," and I thought it was very encouraging. It sounded good, and at the end of the meeting, they all voted the idea completely down. They had no interest in PSS, and I couldn't figure out why. And I asked the MLA who was at the meeting supporting this after, and he said, well, he was saying chicken shit. Every time you made a point, he was saying chicken shit. And so that's the kind of reception we were getting in some municipalities and continued to get during the 70s and 80s, but more gradually came in as time went on.
The network of PSS directors and practitioners in Alberta continued to grow. Some of the discussion between communities and among directors turned to concepts of community development and facilitation, not so much about child welfare and reducing caseloads and social assistance. These distinctions motivated a program review by the government.
So some of the ministers were very threatened by this, and this one minister was. And so he called a total review of the program, clearly with view to putting it out of its misery. And the two committees, one of directors, interestingly, was set up, and one of board members. And they both, after due consideration, came back with the report that this was a marvelous program. And the local people really supported it because they didn't want to lose, their good community-based programs, which they all viewed as healthy. And so then the minister was in a bind. Now what was he going to do? And he did what most governments do. When they're in this situation, they'll try and put their stamp on it. They'll change some elements and put a stamp on it. And so he changed it. The program was then changed. I think there were other elements added to it at the time. I think the province was not to be so involved, which was a healthy thing, in approving projects, for one. And the other thing was the name. The name Preventive Social Services always bothered some people in government. One, social implies problems, or social anything was as bad as community development. Some words you didn't use. And preventive meant that what you're preventing problems, so that was an unhealthy connotation. And so my staff were asked for all kinds of good names for the new program. They wanted to rename it. And we sent down some marvelous suggestions. We sat around over lunch and kicked this around and sent them all down. And then the minister announced Family and Community Support Services, and none of those words had we used. I mean, we almost fell over when we heard this, because they'd taken social out and they'd taken preventive out because of the bad connotations. And Family and Community Support Service, it wasn't a bad name, but it's a big clumsy handle, And so they stamped their revised program, if you will, as Family and Community Support Services.
The report that John refers to was prepared by a University of Alberta professor, Leslie Bella. This 1978 report is probably the most comprehensive analysis of the early years in the FCSS and set the stage for a second report to be completed in 1980. Generally speaking, the report indicated that some of the macro outcomes anticipated in the creation of PSS such as the ability to impact welfare rates, weren't necessarily coming to bear. But on a micro level, the program was reaching deeply into the communities and making a difference in the lives of individual Albertans and their families. The report was well received by politicians and administrators alike, and it provided confidence for the relatively new Progressive Conservative government in power to retain the program, but under a new name, Family and Community Support Services. Bill 7 was passed in 1981, and it repealed the previous PSS legislation and incorporated the changes recommended in the Ballot Report. 1994 marked the beginning of what could be the end of FCSS. And to help explain this point in history, I'll be turning to Colleen Jensen, who at the time was the social planning manager for the city of Red Deer and an active FCSS director on the association. As Premier Klein was seeking to address Alberta's deficit, a decision was made to move FCSS from Alberta Social Services to Alberta Municipal Affairs, and to change the funding from being conditional to unconditional.
In 1994, when we finally realized that for sure there was going to be something major happening within FCSS, and then the announcement came that it was going to be moving over to municipal affairs, and it was going to be unconditional funding, and that was tied a lot to the municipal assistance grants, because they had moved those grants, which were already unconditional. They were lumping a whole bunch of other things into it, and so FCSS was going to go into that pot.
The Klein government was feeling justified in their decision to move the $34 million allocated to FCSS. In a media release, Klein indicated that they wanted to streamline administration and leave more of the local decision-making in the hands of the municipalities.
As I've said before, that there was a piece of be careful what you ask for, because they were using that, whether it was an excuse or not, they were utilizing that as the rationale to do what they did.
Critics of the proposed government changes felt that by combining FCSS with the other unconditional grants would make it easier for the province to simply cut back on the overall amounts in the unconditional grant package. The onus for keeping FCSS alive would therefore be transferred to the municipalities. The move drew significant criticism from Alberta municipalities and set off a firestorm of letters to the province.
To the minister, and indicated that, you know, FCSS really, social programming really was part of the provincial responsibility, and so as municipalities we felt strongly that they shouldn't be let off the hook for that. So they needed to maintain that responsibility and go back to the huge plus of FCSS, where in fact municipalities had the decision making, but the funding was held by the province under the guidelines of some very good legislation. So municipalities had a one-time window to decide which direction did they want to go. And certainly, if you looked at it population-wise, the majority of the province wanted the conditional funding. But there was still a number of municipalities, and most of them were small rural municipalities that didn't have a lot of money and saw this as an opportunity to gain some perhaps extra provincial funding to their municipality that they had control over, wanted to remain with it being unconditional.
The argument being made was that preventive social services was part of the province's broader social services mandate. Clearly, the province had responsibility for the FCSS Act and regulations, and really had the best of both worlds. Municipalities paid into the program and took on the administration and program delivery roles. By March 1995, a review of the provincial FCSS Act and regulation was back on the books. Communications with AUMA and AAMD&C were scheduled to review some of the proposed changes. But the change in provincial government funding for FCSS wasn't the only thing brewing.
So in 1995, there was a resolution put forward at the Provincial Association AGM that the Provincial Association would be disbanded. And that came out ahead of the conference, and so Red Deer decided that our FCSS board would put forward a resolution which was totally the opposite of that the association would basically be reborn. And so Red Deer worked to do a revision of the bylaws, and were granted the opportunity at that conference in 1995 to be able to present the changes. So we had copies that we handed out at the meeting. We presented all of those changes during the day before the meeting. And so people had time to take them away and look at them and think about it. And then at the meeting, basically there were the two primary resolutions. One was to disband the association, and one was to breathe new light into the association. And certainly one of the key people, of course, that took on the role of president was Don Johnson at that time. And that was, I believe, it was maybe Don's first conference even that he'd been to. And we were able to convince him. He was very interested and asked lots of questions as we were going through the presentation about the new bylaws. And so we were able to convince him that he ought to run for the president, and he did, and of course was well received. And he played a really important role. That he was very well connected politically. He had done work on Klein's campaign. He had really had a lot of involvement with the government overall, and so that was very, very helpful as we were moving forward, because he knew the ins and outs of the provincial government and was able to make really good contact from that perspective.
The letter writing and meetings between municipalities and the provincial government continued. The work done by several key people kept FCSS in the forefront of Premier Klein's mind. By February 1996, the province agreed to pull the funding back into Alberta Family and Social Services.
So in early '96, the province indicated that they were going to look at moving it back to Family and Social Services, but there was going to be a review. So again, the association now, having been reconstituted in the latter part of '95, was in a good position to work with the province. And that was really how we wanted to approach things. So not fight against them, but to work with them. And that was really important. And not everybody agreed with that approach, but my own bias is that that worked really, really well. And so toward the end of 1996, we had come up with a funding model as well as revisions to the Act. And those were circulated then at the conference, provincial conference, to be looked at the AGM. So again, there was a presentation done on the Act and regulations and a separate act done on the funding formula. And I was very nervous about the funding formula one because, again, it's very difficult to get a funding formula that everyone is happy with when you're looking at over 300 municipalities and anything from tiny urban municipalities of 200 or 300 people to urban municipalities over 1 million, and then rural MDs and counties. It's very difficult, and so I certainly was nervous going forward that we wanted to make sure that we had very strong support, and we did. So when it was presented and then voted on at the annual general meeting, both the Act and regulations as well as the funding formula was soundly supported. So when the government went forward to actually implement the changes, they could feel very confident that it was going to be received well by all of the municipalities because it had been voted on at the conference.
The 1990s continued as a time for renewal and regeneration. New strategies emerged to strengthen the relationships between local programs, the association, and the province of Alberta. One such initiative included the Program Advisory Team, or PAT as it was known, a collaborative working group that included all the partners. PAT continued for many years providing advice on program delivery issues, undertaking joint projects to support and develop FCSS, and proposing policy amendments to both the association and the ministry. Arrived on the FCSS scene in 2001 as the provincial director for the newly created Community Support Branch, a division of Alberta Children's Services. I had an opportunity to catch up with Tim in Edmonton to talk about highlights from the beginning of the new millennium. Certainly, one of the most memorable came in 2001 at the FCSS AA conference in Jasper. I asked Tim for the backstory on this one.
Well, when I started with FCSS, first job that I had, the program had just been redesigned. So my job was to implement the redesign. At that point, there was $32 million that the province was putting into the program. And I started in January, went to my first Directors Network meeting in March, equipped with this wonderful bonus from the province, which was an additional $500,000. And had a chat with the deputy at the time and said, well, you know, we've got this good announcement, so went boldly up and talked to the Directors Network and said, hey, you've got great news, there's $500,000, and there was dead silence in the room. And one of the long-time directors came up and said, well, you know, thank you very much, and realizing you're new here, we were expecting $13 million. So that was kind of my introduction to where funding was at with FCSS. And it really took the minister of the day, Iris Evans, who had her own experience with FCSS from the municipal level, working in the county of Strathcona and understanding what that meant to a municipality, to take the recommendations that were in that redesign, and one of them was about funding, and there was a funding that to fully fund the FCSS program would require $13 million in additional dollars. And didn't happen right away, but she sort of kept talking to people and working that through. And at a conference, FCSS Association conference, we had a meeting with her in the morning, and we were kind of kicking around, you know, could we manage $5 million? You know, could we put that into the FCSS program? So, you know, that was sort of an unanswered question, but kind of had a feeling that that might be what was coming down. And lo and behold, she got up to the microphone and she announced $15 million into the program. And came back to the table after and looked at me and said, you weren't expecting that, were you?
The same review that sparked the additional funding also raised questions and created the opportunity to examine the business of FCSS. In 2001, a working group succeeded in conducting a literature review, selecting a framework for a new outcomes model, and identifying 7 pilot sites that volunteered to implement the new framework.
So another thing that came out of the redesign of FCSS in sort of the 98-99 period was a recognition that FCSS really needed to tell the story differently, tell the story better. We had lots of ways of counting things, so we could count the number of program participants, so we knew how many people attended, we knew what they attended in terms of program types, but we didn't really know what happened to them or what happened to the communities because of those resources and because of those programs and services. So we needed to be able to find out what it is that happened as a result. How did their lives change? Did they change for the better? Communities, are they different because this program or service was there, these resources are here, and be able to use that in a decision-making model. So whether it's talking to ministers or talking to cabinet, or it's talking to local councils or FCSS boards, the difference between making a decision on allocating some resources based on the number of people that attended the program, and should it be more or should it be less, or was that the right number, and knowing what actually happened to either the people and or the communities that the program and services were for and existed in. This had changed their lives in this way, so that for some reason, in some way, their life was now better than it was before, and in a lot of cases, profoundly better. Some of the stories are about, if it wasn't for this program, I'd be on the streets, or my family wouldn't be together. I mean, these are profound impacts on people. You don't get that when you just report the numbers. You don't get that experience. And decision makers don't have access to that when you just talk about numbers. So in looking at that, we put a group together that was from FCSS programs and really looked at what would be meaningful measures and indicators that were outcome related instead of just accounting for the number of people that attended or the types of programs that were offered. So that really took FCSS down a road of establishing on its own terms what it was that was meaningful about the programs, about the resources, about the services, but moreover about the impacts for people and the people we're concerned about and care about, and the communities. How do those changes happen? Are those the best things to be doing to accomplish the outcomes that have been identified? If not, what do you do differently? We had to divorce the funding from the outcome measuring, because there's a natural tendency to assume that if we have bad outcomes, then we're going to get less funding. If we take that away, and it's really a conversation about, did we accomplish what we accomplished with the programs and services? If we did, great. Do we do more of that, or do we do something else? If we didn't, then were the intended outcomes not quite right in terms of what we should have expected? Or is there something we can do differently so that we can get to those intended outcomes? It's what's the best thing we can do with the resources we have available to get to the outcomes that we need to get, community by community by community. And I think that's the real difference in how FCSS has approached outcome measuring. It's really about continuous improvement. It's really focused on individuals and communities and the programs and services and the impact on their lives and the communities they live in and how they are engaged in their communities.
Minister Evans continued to examine opportunities to improve FCSS during her term in Alberta Children's Services. As a catalyst for community action, FCSS is often the go-to group to help make things happen, and she supported in the way in which FCSS could bring people and organizations together. She also acknowledged that resources were necessary to help in that process. The Community Partnership Enhancement Fund, or CPEF, was an opportunity for two key programs within the same ministry to build relationships, and an example of the type of support that Minister Evans was open to. As the budgets grew and Alberta's population continued to shift toward the urban centres, an increasing disparity began to emerge between communities with growing populations and those in decline. Tim highlights the work of the Rural Issues Working Group.
So in 2005, a new minister to the department and to the ministry, and one of the things that she asked for at the time was a review of the FCSS program. The redesign had been done, implemented in 98, 99, so it was a number of years later. Just wanted to look at the program in terms of how it was operating. So there was an MLA-led committee put together under George Rogers. And one of the outcomes, one of the recommendations from that group was to really look at the impact on rural communities over the last 10, 20 years of the program. There was a provision in the regulation about grandfathering, so that it really said that no community would get less money than it had before. As time went on, though, the gap gets further and further, so the ones that are gaining population got increased dollars when they were available. The ones who were staying stable or losing population ended up with the same money. Over 5 years, the same money buys less, so in essence, they're losing money. So the rural communities, in a working group that they put together, identified this as an issue. So in implementing the recommendations, one of the things that sort of changed fundamentally the way the allocation went in the program was to bring all of those programs up to an amount of funding that they would have had they had steady inflationary increases over that period of time. So as a result, the rural communities, grandfathering provision stayed, but there was an ability to accommodate their needs for additional funding just to do the business they needed to do.
This truly has been a journey. From our humble beginnings, 13 community programs and a provincial budget less than $1 million in 1967-68, to a robust system of community connections, topping more than 300 programs and reaching virtually every Albertan, we've come a long way. The journey isn't just about that which we can count either. As you follow the story of PSS and then FCSS, you hear about iterative and enlightened conversations in communities. We've moved in our thinking from a perspective that social assistance and social welfare are individual and family conditions to simply be avoided, to conversations where we're attempting to understand the root causes behind the need for community support. There are many threads that FCSS has woven in creating Alberta social fabric, and each thread is connected to a story and a varied perspective on life here in Alberta. This has been one thread. It's been my pleasure to share it with you.